Lovely. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name's Karis. I'm the Communications Manager at Protection Group International. We're Complete IT's cybersecurity partner. I would like to introduce PGI's Director of Cyber Operations, Dr. Meredith Patton, and I'll be grilling her on some of the challenges organisations face in getting their cybersecurity right and getting the most from their outsourced consultants. And sorry, you've got the two Australians from PGI today, so hopefully you'll understand us. We should probably start with a bit of an explanation around the title. So we came up with cybersecurity starting as you mean to go on while we were sort of putting things together. Meredith, I think it might be a good idea if you started off explaining why we chose that.
Of course, Karis. I'd just like to point out that you're way more Australian than I am. Anyway, with regards to the title, when we started workshopping some of the content for this, I started by thinking about some of the challenges I've seen clients encounter over the years. That's both from my experience in the private sector and the public sector, when it comes to tackling cybersecurity. So obviously everyone's different. Every client I've seen has been different, but definitely one of the repeat issues I've tended to see is that people can tend to treat cybersecurity as a product rather than as a practice or a set of practices. On the really positive side, we see a lot of clients genuinely wanting to do something to improve their cybersecurity, and this is absolutely a great start. Good to see. What we do see sometimes, though, is that start and that enthusiasm isn't necessarily backed up by good follow-on. So I suppose there's always a spectrum. At the worst end of the spectrum, you get the sort of set and forget approach where people just want to buy in a solution and pretty much carry on as they were before and forget about it and be happy that it's all taken care of by somebody else. At best, we see businesses making a really concentrated effort at certain times. For example, if they're at the sort of beginning of doing something about cybersecurity and they're very enthusiastic, or where they're just about to go into an audit and they feel like they need to sort of tidy the house up, but they're not necessarily establishing embedded practices, which is kind of the whole point of having these processes in place and sort of getting an information security management system in place. So what we meant by the title is basically trying to maintain that sense of momentum once you've made the commitment to do something about your cybersecurity.
So from that, I've taken that cyber risk isn't something that you can just throw money at to make it go away.
Well, as a person working at a cybersecurity consultancy, I'm sure my boss would want me to say at this point that you should definitely throw lots and lots and lots of money at cybersecurity, and you should definitely throw that money in the direction of PGI. But actually, no, what we are saying is that if you're going to invest money in cybersecurity, there are things you can do to get better value out of that investment. So to be clear, it's absolutely a good idea to buy in expertise that you don't necessarily have in-house. Good cybersecurity advice is, I would say, seriously one of the best investments a company can make, particularly in this day and age. But what I would like is for more clients to think about it as buying in change rather than buying a thing or a product. I think when we put out the synopsis for this talk, we kind of used a health and fitness analogy. And in the same way, you can spend a lot on products and services to improve your health. And I think everybody can probably see that magnificent rower in the background of my meeting room. I've obviously done this for myself. The rower makes a great frame for drying a fitted sheet on, but it's kind of that point, isn't it? That it's not going to be successful if you don't commit to change. And that's quite an apt analogy for cybersecurity. That change, that commitment to making a difference in your security posture has to come from within your organization.
In that case, what's actually going to be the catalyst for change? When we were preparing this webinar, we talked about a few of the most common, I guess, tipping points that have nudged people into doing something about cyber.
Yeah, we do. We did. Again, I think the health analogy is quite apt here. So frequently the wake-up call for making a real change in your lifestyle or your health can be a serious event like a heart attack or a stroke. And unfortunately, for a lot of organizations I've worked with, similarly, the tipping point for doing something about your cybersecurity is a specific serious event like a ransomware attack or a big data breach where, in some cases, even the very viability of your organization might be put at risk. However, it can be less drastic than that. What I am seeing more of recently is clients realizing that opportunities for their businesses are going to be quite limited if they don't have any cybersecurity in place. For example, they might get an opportunity to partner with a much larger entity in a deal which could hugely increase their value and their opportunities. And then this larger partner sends them a security due diligence checklist as one of the conditions of the partnership. And they realize that there's actually a lot of questions there that they can't provide substantial answers to. The health analogy for this is probably more like realizing that you've got your big party next week and all of a sudden you don't fit into your party outfit anymore. So it's not life-threatening as such, but it's still quite problematic. Increasingly, though, it's also the case that cybersecurity's profile is, I would argue, a lot higher than it used to be. And this is prompting more people to take action actually before they're forced to, which I think is also a very positive development. In particular, there's a lot more reporting, especially in the sort of mainstream media, on the prevalence and severity of cyber attacks, ransomware attacks in particular. Ransomware has been a substantial topic of discussion at successive G7 meetings, including the most recent one. We're also seeing a lot more discussion of legislation around this issue, albeit I've seen some movements in Australia, for example, where they're debating a critical infrastructure bill that would impose quite strict cybersecurity requirements on critical infrastructure providers. And in the US, also at the moment, I think they're circulating a bipartisan draft bill that's going to force critical infrastructure providers to report to the government when they suffer a successful cyber attack. You might also have seen the story about the AXA, the insurance giant, deciding that it would not provide payouts for ransomware attacks, whereupon it promptly got hit by a ransomware attack itself shortly after, I think. So also, and that brings me to the point that cyber insurance is also much more of a mainstream thing than it was even a couple of years ago, although still comparatively low take-up. Naturally, insurance companies are demanding more evidence of robust security measures before insuring an organization as well.
So you're the head of the division at PGI that looks after all the cyber services. I think with all that context in mind, I think it would be really useful to look at what clients are struggling with the most, or just businesses in general.
I actually think one of the things that people and organizations are struggling with the most, and that's both providers and clients, is just metrics and data. I've noted quite a lot of variation in published numerical claims about, for example, the severity and frequency of cyber attacks. Sometimes the source of that information can be quite vague. It can simply be an article claiming that various studies show that ransomware is on the rise. Obviously it is. It can be quite confusing. On the client side, I think this makes it difficult to make an informed decision about how serious the threat is, whether it applies to your organization. And again, the health and well-being analogy can be quite apt here, because there are some core basic messages, as there are in health, like eat less, exercise more type of thing. In cybersecurity, this comes around sort of things like patching, data backup, restricting admin rights on your network. But there is a lot of extra information out there too, and as I said, varying accounts of how severe the threat is and to whom it applies. So it's also good to have reliable data on what comparable organizations to yours are doing about the problem. And in that respect, I think some good data comes from surveys. And I personally like the reports that have been coming out of DCMS, that's the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport in the UK, which surveys around 1,500 UK organisations and distinguishes them on size and sector and just asks them a whole lot of questions about what they're doing about their cybersecurity. Companies are also struggling with a market that offers loads and loads of different options, of course, and many of these might not be easily understandable to somebody outside the sector. For example, a penetration test versus a vulnerability scan, which do you choose, which is right for you? The merits of ISO 27001 certification, should I go for it or should I do something different? There's a justifiable perception that it's quite difficult for smaller organizations in particular to understand what they really need to do versus what would be more of a nice to have.
So I guess this is the point of today's session. How do you figure that out? How do you figure out the difference between understanding what they need versus what would be nice to have? And how do you get that from a consultant?
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, one of the points I wanted to make today is that scoping your requirement is definitely one area where good consultancy will help and is probably worth investing in, because I think the best cybersecurity is not just effective, but it's also fit for purpose. And that's a very individual thing for each organization. It starts with understanding what your risk profile and appetite look like. And nearly all risks can be mitigated, but a lot of them can't be avoided altogether and probably shouldn't be avoided altogether, because the cost and expense of doing that is possibly more than it's worth. So a good consultant will want to help a client start by asking the right questions about these issues and how they relate exactly to them, rather than just selling them something that's completely gold plated. So for example, at PGI, even when a client comes to us with a really definite idea of what they want to do, for example, they've decided that they absolutely need to get ISO 27001 certification in place, we'll always start the conversation with a bit of a chat about why they want to do this. And not always, but in more than one case, we've seen that the conversation has actually revealed that what they actually needed was an initial way of assessing risk consistently within their organization, or that they could start with getting some really basic components of cybersecurity in place so that they have more of a starting point to begin and grow from. Also, for clients who have already started that journey of making change to their cybersecurity, we often suggest a thing called a cybersecurity maturity assessment. And this looks at your security arrangements across a range of different data points. For example, network security, physical security, education and awareness. And critically, maturity assessment is good because it identifies when no further investment is needed, either because the client has accepted the risk or because it's already doing pretty well against that particular area. And that therefore they don't need to invest any further. Generally, I'd say in terms of most of the cybersecurity maturity assessments we've conducted over, say, the last year, the areas we see companies struggle with a bit more than others are things like incident response, prep, supply chain, and education. Supply chain, I mean, just by checking that if you've got a chain of suppliers, that you're confident that they've got good security in place as well. What a lot of this comes back to, Karis, is that managing cybersecurity isn't just about the technical aspects like computer networks and IT security. There's a vast human element to it as well. So it only takes one employee, one email with a malicious attachment opened by that employee with not enough cybersecurity awareness, and that can result in a ransomware attack that can bring operations to a halt. And that has actually happened very recently to a client I'm talking to. It was a single laptop that they brought in and connected up to the company network, and because it had a virus on it, they were crippled. And because their backup data was on the same server as well, they didn't have backups to restore from, so it was a pretty serious situation for them.
Broadly, though,
sorry,
it's worth looking at the report you mentioned to look at some of the information and the data. It's pretty apparent that a lot of businesses still aren't taking some of the key measures to protect themselves from cyber attacks. And in some areas, the percentage of companies taking those measures is actually trending downwards. So I think it might be worth you touching on what you see as the reason for that.
Yeah, I think we've got a slide on that too, haven't we? Taken from the DCMS report that I cited earlier. This is quite a complicated topic to unpack. It always is when you're talking about why somebody's not doing something as opposed to why they are doing something. So I have to caveat this by saying that it's a pretty anecdotal response based on my particular exposure to clients, as well as a lot of the work I've done for many years from a government position. I think some of it, at least, is about the difficulty that people have envisaging bad things happening to them. And it's always more difficult to make a compelling argument to chuck money at something that only might happen, and especially if it's not mandatory to do so. I think, yeah, a good example of this, which is sort of I drew on for this talk, is that in 1970, Australia was the first Western country in the world to legislate compulsory seatbelts in cars, and subsequent data, which has been well published and used in sort of traffic campaigns as well, has shown a really dramatic decline in road accident deaths since this happened. So it's data that's really readily available. But interestingly, I was posted to the Solomon Islands in 2004. That's for all you Northern Hemisphere folks, that's a really, really tiny country in the South Pacific. And at the time, it was not compulsory to wear a seatbelt in the Solomon Islands. And I routinely saw Australian and other Western government officials driving around Honiara, the capital, without wearing them. And that included their kids as well, which I found quite weird. But it kind of underlined to me the fact that they really couldn't quite envisage a traffic accident happening to them. More understandably, I think a lot of organizations think that they aren't a target because they're too small or don't have enough data likely to be of value to a cyber criminal. This is actually fair enough, and it is backed up by the DCMS report, which notes that small businesses, and that's businesses with fewer than 50 employees, are less likely to be targeted. But it does not mean that they're not targeted at all. One of the recent ransomware victims I spoke to recently has 20 employees, and they still got hit. And basically, if your company's in business and you're connected to the internet, then you are a potential target of cyber attack. And finally, I'm sorry, I'm aware that I'm going on a bit here. I think this plays across all the points I've made today. A lot of clients believe that cybersecurity is just too expensive. And this is also really understandable. Most small businesses have about 5 different places to invest each investment pound they can spare. And this means for me that inevitably small businesses in particular, they're going to take a more minimal approach to security because of cost constraints. What I do stress to potential clients who have at least made the approach to see what they need to do is that cybersecurity can indeed be massively expensive if you take a blanket approach and try and cover everything at once. But if you know what your biggest risks are and where your priorities lie for your business, you will only spend what you need to. And again, the maturity assessment that I mentioned earlier can often help with this. Consultancy can be an excellent investment in this respect because a good consultant will help you answer those questions around risk and priority and focus only what you most need to do.
So I suppose the question is it worth outsourcing?
Yeah, it is definitely worth getting a considered opinion from a subject matter expert about what you need to do. But the value will be very specific. It will depend on your risk appetite and profile. And it will also depend on what expertise and in-house resources you have to do something about your security. It doesn't have to be hugely expensive. What we always see, and what I like to see actually, is companies opting for a mix. That's combining their in-house efforts with support from external consultancy. I do think that's the best way to do it. Even if you did have a massive budget to permanently outsource everything, you still have to be invested in what you're doing. It won't address the issue of organizational culture and its effect on the human behavior element of cybersecurity. It's so critical. I'll say a bit more about this in a minute, but I can't stress enough that getting good value out of cybersecurity consultancy comes down a lot to client engagement and behavior. When an organization outsources, say it's HR or it's legal services or it's procurement, it's still got to be managed internally. And that's absolutely the same for cybersecurity. It needs a lot of interest and attention from the organization's leadership. And so I think this balanced approach where you've got internal engagement and subject matter expertise, possibly from an outside source, is really good for achieving permanent and sustainable change. For example, if you have a company come in and do the setup work, you put in place an information security framework, you do need to continue with that and pay attention to it rather than just dig it out when the audit is due and give it a bit of a look.
Meredith, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you briefly. A couple of members of the audience are finding you a bit muffled. Is there anything that you can do?
Oh God, I'm sorry. It's usually a case of hair in front of microphone. Is that any better, guys?
I think that sounded a bit better.
Yeah.
Sorry, everyone. Okay,
Apologies
next question.
for that. Yeah.
So in saying all of that, why wouldn't a company just stop it at getting Cyber Essentials then?
They might well do. Cyber Essentials, that's the certification run by the IASME Corporation. It is a brilliant way of starting to look at your cybersecurity maturity and to ask questions about your setup. And it was expressly set up for small organizations that might not have a massive budget for security. I would say though that at a basic level, Cyber Essentials is great. But it is a self-assessment that's albeit validated by your senior leadership. It doesn't give you as much assurance over possibly more complex elements of your security, and it doesn't give you or your clients the assurance that comes with being externally validated, because it is that self-assessment process. So if I was going to pick a sort of metaphor or analogy to explain that, it's like shutting the door on the way out of your home and making sure that it's locked up, but it doesn't tell you whether your locks could be picked easily or if there are windows on your house that are easy to break open. So I think often the sort of tricky issue with security is that you might not know what you don't know, and you might need a specialist to tell you that you don't actually need to do as much as you thought you did. As I said previously, a good consultant won't just go along with your views of what you think you need to do. They'll question you a lot and ask you lots of questions about your organizational setup. So if cybersecurity isn't your area of expertise, you don't have in-house expertise on security, getting external input will help you ask the right questions, and hiring a specialist in might save you money in the long term, because a good specialist will tell you what you don't need as well as what you do need. And they'll do that based on a thorough understanding of your business priorities and risk appetites.
Okay, so you've been going quite a few things, and I want to know, what are some of the tangible things that people could go back to their business with to actually sort of get the ball rolling and to get the most out of consultancy?
First and foremost, I'd recommend doing some reading on cybersecurity, and I'd like to stress it doesn't have to be technical. As well as the media reporting, there's a lot of good media reporting on specific events like the ransomware attacks. I'd be looking regularly at publications by the National Cybersecurity Centre, and also some of the other experts who blog about cybersecurity. Twitter has actually been a great source of this sort of expertise for me. I follow quite a few people on Twitter who blog regularly about information security. Kieran Martin, who until recently was the director of the NCSC, he's fantastic to follow on Twitter because he tweets himself, but he also posts links to stuff that he finds interesting, and it's a really good shortcut for me in terms of reading about cybersecurity. I would also recommend the IASME website, which has a lot of really good resources, including free access to the Cyber Essentials questionnaire for people to have a look at. I'd also encourage people to have a think about your organization and understand what matters most to you in terms of your organization being healthy and profitable. So what would cause your organization to fail? Is it your website going down or your server being unavailable? How would a major data breach, for example, involving your data, your client's data, impact your organization in the short and long term? So it's really important to do that in order to overcome that sort of it couldn't ever happen to me mindset, and to think about that worst case possible scenario. Also, you kind of need to think about, in the event of a data breach, what a massive fine for a data breach could do to your organization financially, because they are handing out big fines for data breaches these days. Thirdly, and possibly like this is particularly a topic close to my heart, if you do buy in consultancy, please listen to your consultant. It is a partnership. You are absolutely going to know most about your business and what your business needs, but they probably know more about cybersecurity than you do. And therefore, I'd urge people to be generous with their consultant in terms of time and attention. It's really good to engage consultancy, but if you can't provide them with the time and information they need in order to provide you with their experience and specialist knowledge, it's going to be a bit of a waste of money, and you might end up with, even if they draft you policies, for example, they might end up looking quite generic rather than tailored to fit your organization. Finally, sorry, no, not quite finally, penultimately, get top-down buy-in. This is so critical. I can't say this often enough, but basically, leadership behaviors evidence what is important to an organization. and it sets the agenda for action. So if your leadership isn't interested in the security issue or doesn't understand it, it's very unlikely you'll get the traction you need to make real and permanent change. So finally, yeah, it's not just set and forget. It shouldn't be just set and forget for security. It's about lifestyle changes, basically behavioral changes. And often, as with lifestyle changes, people start off really enthusiastic, but keeping up that enthusiasm can be quite difficult. And again, this comes back to your leadership buy-in as well. So to make all that work count, to make all that enthusiasm count and keep up the momentum, I think people just need to pay attention to it and make it a permanent change. Otherwise, you might end up in a situation where you're kind of buying stuff in from scratch each year and starting again. And that's kind of a bit demoralizing as well as potentially very, very expensive.
Thank you, Meredith. I guess
Thank you,
that brings us to the end, but we do have time for questions. So we've got a few here. We're more than happy to take more. If you have any questions about something Meredith's spoken about or something that might even not be on the topic list, she's quite happy to be challenged. The first question I've had is, what are some of the more complex elements of security that won't be covered by Cyber Essentials?
So Cyber Essentials just looks at a number of structures you've got in place. Cyber Essentials Plus, which is the next level up, is actually a technical evaluation. So they'll typically take a sample. A consultant will take a sample of the devices you've got, so laptops, phones, and actually look at them for the technical security measures they've got in place. Similarly, Cyber Essentials might ask if you've got a policy in place. You know, do you have a change management policy in place? Something more complex like ISO 27001 will actually go into an audit, will go into quite a lot of detail. You'll have an external auditor come in and actually ask to see evidence of that policy being in place and also evidence of that policy being followed. So Cyber Essentials is more like Cyber Essentials, and a lot of people have said this commenting on the IASME website, it's a great starting point for thinking about cybersecurity. It prompts organizations to think, I actually haven't got anything like that in place, and I might need to. More complex audits like ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials Plus will actually go a lot further towards demonstrating that it's in place.
Cool. And our next question, and this might be a bit hard, I think it's quite subjective in some ways. How do you know if a consultant is any good?
Oh gosh. Yeah, that is a very tricky one. It's one that I expected to come up, so I did think about it. And I did talk to some of our consultants about it beforehand. I think a good consultant is one who will be very curious about your organization and ask lots of questions. They won't take much as read because a really good cybersecurity and good consultancy will tailor something that fits your organization's needs within a framework of regulations and good practice, of course, but it will take the elements of that good practice which most apply to you. So in order to get there and produce something really tailored, they'll want quite a bit of your time sort of looking at what you've got in place, what policies have you got in place, what do you want to achieve, what are your biggest concerns as a business, and ask you loads and loads of questions. They won't just they won't take much at face value, I think, a good consultant.
Great.
And they'll also listen, as well, and spend time getting to the bottom of what your organization is like, of course.
What's the difference? So we're going to branch off slightly. Claire Humphreys would like to know what the difference is between a penetration test and a vulnerability scan.
Yeah, a vulnerability scan uses a number of tools, usually automated, to just look at a network and scan it for potential vulnerabilities. A penetration test is where you tee up with the owner beforehand and you're actually seeking permission from them and some technical information from them that allows you to simulate a hack against their network. So you're actually trying to hack into their network. So it's basically a lot more involved. I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but I can't right off the top of my head.
So the analogy that I use, the analogy I use is that almost like your door locking that you mentioned earlier. Basically, a vulnerability scan is going to be checking what your locks are like, if they're good, if there are any, broken locks or ones that don't work the way that they should. Whereas a penetration test is actually somebody manually going in to see what would happen if you try those locks.
That's actually pretty good. When I worked for it was called the Defence Signals Directorate back in the day. It's Australia's Signals Intelligence Agency. We did actually get one of the other security agencies to do sort of a physical penetration test on the compound, and go around and try the fences and stuff and see if they could blag their way in. So yeah, good analogy. I can see a question from Claire again. It's the IASME website that lists the cybersecurity essentials questions. Yeah, they'll give you access to it. So if you just Google IASME, IASME, or even Cyber Essentials, it'll come up pretty much near the top of any Google search.
When you talk about incident response, what do you, and incident response preparation, what do you actually mean?
Yeah, for most organizations, a cybersecurity incident is quite traumatic. In the heat of the moment, it's very, very disconcerting, very worrying to find that you can't access anything or all your systems are shut down. So incident response preparation is aimed at preparing people to have a plan in the event of that happening. And also really good incident response will sort of almost think about the aftermath of an incident response as well. So an incident response plan will look at things like, what's your data backup? So if you have good data backup and your data is immune from being attacked, then you can restore your systems from backup, and therefore you're going to minimize the impact of an attack. Yeah, so incident response planning is about how to best deal with the worst possible scenario, worst case scenario.
If there's one thing you could recommend, I know we sort of had those takeaways before, but if there's one thing you could recommend that every person who's attending today could go away and talk to the rest of their business about, or something tangible they can do, what would that be?
If they haven't done it, I would have to say start with Cyber Essentials. That's what it's there for. And then that can be a really good springboard for a serious conversation about security with your senior management. So that's the sort of...
What sorts of things, Meredith, would you be having a conversation about?
I'd be having a conversation about what's our risk profile, what would shut our organization down. It's basic business continuity planning, which is why a lot of information assurance consultancy will also include a business continuity aspect. So what would shut us down? What would seriously impact us, and what are we prepared to do about it? Are we prepared to tolerate the risk, or do we want to mitigate that risk in some way? And also, of course, what the threat is as well.
Thank you. We've had a question from Paul Simpson. For my organization's latest penetration test, the testing company started out by asking us to whitelist one of their IP addresses so they had one foothold already within our network, at least for some of their tests. Not to say that they didn't perform initial tests avoiding that route, however. I found it odd and did challenge it, but was approved at head office level. Is that quite common?
Ooh, I'm really sorry. That question extends a bit beyond the limit of my technical knowledge, but I can take it to the head of my pen test team, who will be able to answer it. Yeah, I do know that I have sat on a number of pen test scoping calls with my consultants, and we always get the company to provide us with the range of IP addresses that they want in scope of the test, so that we don't disrupt data. Because the other aspect of a penetration test that's important that I do know is that if a company has ongoing operations, the penetration test shouldn't disrupt things or shut things down. And so we're always very careful to go over that with companies. Recently, with one company we dealt with, they did give us not a live version of their application to test, but a sort of containerized version of it, because they felt that while it wasn't the actual application, doing a containerized version of it lowered the risk that we might disturb something or disrupt something, and it would still give decent results against that application. So I believe there are good reasons for doing it, and it does come again with some considerations around risk. So it may not be exactly the same as a complete live attack on your system, but it might be good enough, and it might ameliorate other risks like disruption to operations and things like that.
I could probably add a little bit to that, because I happen to spend a lot of time with our penetration testers.
Might alone. Yeah.
Basically, a penetration test, you hire a company to do that, and they've got a set period of time in which they can do it. So when you've got a cyber criminal or, you know, nation state actors, for example, they've got all the time in the world, really. So they can spend time looking for those ways in that will then allow them to pivot through the system. Whereas we don't have that opportunity necessarily. We might only have a short amount of time to find that vulnerability that gets us in, so that we can actually access all those other vulnerabilities within the system. So in some cases, yes, we will have somebody whitelist an IP address so that we have that foothold, and we don't spend our entire testing time actually looking for that foothold, because you know what, it may not exist, but one day it could, because you know, patches come along not fast enough in some cases, and then once you're in, there's all these other vulnerabilities. So there's multiple layers to it. So if you've got layer 1 that's actually pretty good, something may come along eventually, and layer 2, 3, and 4 may or may not actually be as strong as you'd like it to be. So I hope that helps.
Wow, you're just wasted in communications, Karis.
Do we have any other questions? Great. If there are any other questions, I know that there's possibly people wanting to get off to lunch if they've waited this long. If you do have any other questions, I know that if you email inquiries@completeIT.co.uk, they can pass those inquiries on to us. If you just have any sort of general questions about cybersecurity and whether or not you're heading in the right direction, we're also happy to help you with that as well. And I know that the team at Complete IT would be happy to make that happen.
Oh, could I say one more thing, Karis? I had a thought relating to the question about what makes a good consultant. And I'd like to stress that a good consultant will be generous with their time in the first instance. So they'll spend a fair bit of time on their own dollar, I'd like to stress, setting things up, answering questions, and doing it before we get around to the sort of issue of a proposal too. So if the consultant you're talking to isn't willing to invest a little bit of time in that upfront, then yeah, I might be questioning that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Meredith. Thank you very much, Complete IT, for having us. We hope you all got something out of this session, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you
so
both
much,
for
everybody.
joining us.